Access to a digital service is structured around uninterrupted membership. The rule is simple. As long as the subscription remains active, access continues without friction, establishing continuity as the default state. This structure creates a clear incentive gradient. Continuous access is rewarded with stability and pricing advantages, while interruption triggers immediate loss and re-entry friction, shifting the decision from usage optimization to access preservation. Subscribers respond by adjusting renewal behavior. Instead of evaluating whether the service is actively used, they begin to buffer renewals ahead of expiration, ensuring no gap occurs in access. The decision shifts from use or not use to maintain or lose. Once access is treated as something that can be lost instantly, avoiding disruption becomes the dominant rational move. This creates a divergence between visible signals and underlying value. Active membership is observable, but actual usage intensity is not, allowing renewal decisions to persist even when engagement declines. A plausible interpretation emerges. It appears that subscribers continue because they find ongoing value in the service, reinforcing the idea that retention reflects satisfaction. However, this explanation fails under closer inspection. Usage does not need to remain high for renewal to persist, indicating that continuation is not strictly tied to consumption value. The underlying mechanism is not usage-driven retention. It is the cost structure around losing access that redefines the decision boundary, making cancellation disproportionately costly relative to continuation. Once this cost asymmetry becomes stable, behavior reorganizes around it. Subscribers begin to treat expiration as a risk event rather than a neutral endpoint. Renewal buffering becomes a predictable adaptation. Users renew early or maintain auto-renewal to avoid any exposure to re-entry friction, even if current usage does not justify it. This produces artificial usage persistence at the system level. Membership remains active across periods of low or zero engagement, decoupling access status from actual service consumption. The system begins to accumulate latent inactivity. A growing portion of subscribers retain access without actively extracting value, but remain locked in due to continuity incentives. What appears as strong retention is not purely demand-driven. It is partially sustained by the structure of penalties tied to interruption, which discourages reevaluation. The system stabilizes around continuity rather than optimization. Maintaining access becomes the default rational strategy, even when the underlying value fluctuates. This creates a dependency loop. The longer access is maintained, the more costly interruption feels, reinforcing the incentive to continue renewing. Re-entry friction amplifies this effect. Losing features, pricing advantages, or accumulated status increases the perceived cost of cancellation, tightening the lock-in. Over time, the decision space narrows. Subscribers are no longer comparing alternatives freely, but instead minimizing the risk of losing existing access. This transforms the nature of the relationship. The service is no longer evaluated per period of use, but as a continuous state that must be preserved. Artificial persistence becomes normalized. Periods of non-use no longer trigger cancellation because the cost of interruption outweighs the benefit of stopping. The system reaches a stable equilibrium. Subscribers maintain membership primarily to preserve access continuity, rather than to actively consume the service. At this point, retention reflects dependency more than engagement. The visible signal of loyalty conceals an underlying structure driven by access preservation incentives. As this pattern scales across the subscriber base, renewal buffering becomes synchronized. A large share of users renew not because of usage cycles, but because of aligned exposure to the same expiration risk, compressing decision timing into predictable renewal waves. This synchronization changes how the system behaves over time. Instead of staggered entry and exit based on value, the system experiences clustered continuity, reinforcing stability in active membership regardless of real engagement levels. Time horizon mismatch begins to dominate decision logic. The immediate penalty of losing access outweighs the delayed benefit of evaluating alternatives, shifting all decisions toward short-term preservation rather than long-term optimization. This imbalance accumulates across renewal cycles. Each uninterrupted period increases the perceived cost of interruption, extending the time horizon over which subscribers defer reevaluation. Information asymmetry amplifies this effect. Subscribers can clearly observe their active status and the risk of losing it, but cannot easily quantify how much value they are actually extracting over time. This skews the decision signal. Continuation appears justified by visible access, even when underlying usage would not independently support renewal. The system begins to reinforce its own retention signals. High visible membership levels feed back into perceived normality of continuous subscription, making interruption appear increasingly atypical. At scale, artificial usage persistence becomes structurally embedded. Inactive or low-usage subscribers remain in the system, inflating the baseline of continuous membership and masking true demand signals. This distortion feeds back into future decisions. Because continuity appears widespread, individual subscribers treat uninterrupted access as the expected norm, tightening the incentive to avoid deviation. Re-entry friction further compounds the lock-in. Once a subscriber considers cancellation, the anticipated cost of restoring access later becomes part of the current decision, pushing renewal forward again. The system effectively converts optional participation into positional maintenance. Subscribers are no longer deciding whether to engage, but whether to relinquish a position that has accumulated continuity advantages. Over repeated cycles, this produces path dependence. The longer a subscriber remains continuously active, the less likely they are to interrupt, regardless of fluctuations in actual usage value. The system stabilizes around accumulated continuity rather than active evaluation. Retention becomes a function of past uninterrupted duration, not present utility. At this point, the feedback loop tightens further. Each renewal reinforces the next by increasing the perceived loss associated with breaking continuity, making exit progressively less probable. However, this reinforcement is not infinite. If underlying usage drops below a certain threshold, the accumulated cost of continuation may eventually exceed the perceived loss of interruption. This introduces a point of tension. The system cannot directly observe when this threshold is reached because visible signals remain tied to active status, not actual value extraction. Until that threshold is crossed, the loop continues to harden. Subscribers maintain access through successive low-usage periods, reinforcing the dependency structure without triggering re-evaluation. When interruption finally occurs, it tends to be abrupt rather than gradual. The accumulated deferral of re-evaluation compresses into a single decision point, producing discontinuous exit behavior. This creates a dual-state system dynamic. Subscribers are either deeply locked into continuity or have already exited, with fewer transitional states in between. The equilibrium becomes increasingly rigid. Access preservation dependency governs behavior across the system, with renewal decisions anchored to continuity rather than consumption. In this equilibrium, uninterrupted access becomes the primary reward. Maintaining continuity is consistently reinforced, while actual usage levels no longer determine whether the subscription persists. At the same time, the system begins to ignore fluctuations in engagement. Periods of low or zero usage no longer trigger behavioral change because they do not immediately alter access status. The penalty structure is concentrated around interruption. Losing access introduces immediate friction and delayed recovery costs, making cancellation the only action that carries visible downside. This reshapes the decision boundary for subscribers. Continuation requires no justification, while interruption demands absorbing both immediate loss and future reentry cost. Over time, behavior stabilizes around preserving position rather than evaluating value. Renewal becomes the default action, and deviation from continuity becomes the exception constrained by accumulated penalties. What the system sustains is not continuous usage, but continuous access. And once access becomes the variable being optimized, behavior aligns with preserving it rather than questioning it.